The brass three-arm rotary sprinkler ticked on every Australian front lawn from Whyalla to Coffs Harbour, all summer, every summer, while the cricket was on the ABC and the buffalo grass drank in the afternoon heat. That sprinkler had a name. 4 letters. POPE. On the 1st of July 2024, a press release was issued from Long Island, New York. A holding company called Griffon Corporation announced it had bought the 99-year-old Pope brand from an American multinational called Toro. The price was $21.8 million Australian dollars. Read that again. $21.8 million. For the 99-year-old Australian brand on every front lawn, from Whyalla to Coffs Harbour. Walk into a Bunnings in 2026 and you can still buy a Pope sprinkler. The sticker on the clamshell reads, "Born in a shed in Adelaide in 1925. True, the shed is at 56 Robert Street, West Croydon. It is a private home today, owned in New York. If you grew up with that sound on a Saturday morning, hit subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Sprinkler. That knew the cricket, January 1962, Adelaide. A Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, the temperature already 32 degrees Celsius and climbing. In a weatherboard house on a quarter-acre block in Beverley, somebody has opened the kitchen window. The cricket is on the ABC. Bill Laurie is at the crease, and out on the front lawn, the buffalo grass that every South Australian gardener swore by, because it could survive the summer, there is a brass three-arm Pope rotary sprinkler. Tick, tick, tick. The sound that for 40 years was the sound of an Australian summer. The smell is hot brass and wet grass, and the eucalyptus from the gum trees on the verge. The sprinkler throws water in a 12-foot radius, designed by Adelaide engineers, for the Australian quarter-acre block, 3 arms turning, 2,000 revolutions an hour. Brass that was cast in a foundry 6 suburbs west, hand-machined by men in blue overalls, packed in cardboard boxes printed with the 4-letter brand name that, by 1962, every Australian over the age of 5 knew. POPE, in every front yard from Whyalla to Coffs Harbour, in every garden centre from Hobart to Cairns. The cultural saturation was so complete that the Australian vernacular had absorbed it. Is the Pope a washing machine? The pun that meant, of course, because every Australian household, by 1957, owned at least one Pope washing machine, and the question answered itself. The Pope Show, compared first by Jack Davey on radio, then by Terry Deer on television in the late 1950s, gave Pope appliances away as prizes. A Pope washing machine, a Pope refrigerator, a Pope hi-fi, a Pope rotary sprinkler in a box wrapped in studio cellophane, the Adelaide industrial belt of 1962, Pope at Beverley, GMH at Woodville and Birkenhead, Chrysler at Keswick, was the engine of a state. South Australian Premier. Sir Thomas Playford had built it deliberately. The longest-serving Premier in Australian political history had used 3 decades of state power to make Adelaide the second industrial city of the Commonwealth. The Pope factory at Beverley employed 3,000 people. The streets around the factory, Pope Street, Charles Street, Howards Road, were named after the company. But this story does not begin with a sprinkler. It begins with a teenage clerk in Adelaide in 1923 and a father with a backyard foundry. Northam, Western Australia, the 18th of February 1905. A boy is born. His name is Sydney Barton Pope. His father, Henry Pope, is a South Australian storekeeper. His mother, Sarah Ann Nay Nunn, is the daughter of 19th century English settlers. In 1913, the Pope family moves from Western Australia to Adelaide. Sydney, known to almost everyone, even on the factory floor, as Barton, enrolls at Pulteney Grammar School, one of Adelaide's oldest. Later, he completes a commercial course at Stotts Business College in the city. He is raised Methodist. On the 3rd of May 1922, at 17 years of age, Barton Pope is baptised by full immersion at the North Adelaide Baptist Church. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records the conversion as decisive. For the rest of his life, Sir Sidney Barton Pope is a Baptist. In 1923, aged 18, Barton quits his clerkship and becomes an Adelaide manufacturer's agent, selling other people's products on commission. The business of selling teaches him the business of buying, and in 1924, aged 19, he joins his father. Henry Pope, the storekeeper, has built in a small workshop behind the family home in West Croydon a backyard foundry. He had established a small backyard foundry making fittings for watering systems he supplied and serviced. A backyard foundry. The first Pope sprinkler is cast there. Brass, 3 arms, designed for an Australian quarter-acre block. Soon afterwards, Henry retired. Read that again. The teenage clerk who quit his job in 1923 had by 1924 joined his father, and within a year the father had stepped away. The son was running the company. The address was 56 Robert Street, West Croydon, Adelaide. The original 1925 product was an irrigation sprinkler, brass castings from the foundry behind the family home, fittings designed in Adelaide for Adelaide Gardens. And this date is the date the brand still uses today. Walk into any Bunnings garden centre in Australia in 2026 and you will find a Pope rotary sprinkler in a clamshell. The sticker reads, quote, "Born in a shed in Adelaide in 1925. True. And also, depending on which document you read, 1924 or 1928 or 1935. The brand has its date. The Australian Dictionary of Biography has another. The Corporate Registry has a third. But the foundation moment, the moment Barton Pope took over from his father, was 1924. Within 3 years, the teenage clerk had registered a company. Within 10, he had built a factory in Beverley. And within 12, the same factory would be stamping out parts for an Australian army at war. Chapter 3. The Boy Farm. The 15th of October, 1928. The News, Adelaide's afternoon paper, runs a notice on page 13. Quote, Pope Sprinklers Limited. To acquire and take over as a going concern the business of manufacturers of irrigation sprinklers and fittings, carried on by Sidney Barton Pope and Henry Pope at Robert Street, Croydon. Nominal capital, £15,000. In 1931, the company was renamed Pope Products Limited. In 1934, after a Depression-era voluntary liquidation, it was refloated. And in 1935, Barton Pope built his first proper factory on Charles Road in the Western Adelaide working-class suburb of Beverley. And here is the dark side. The Australian Dictionary of Biography, in its 2012 entry by historian P.K. A. Howell, records what Barton Pope did in those early years to keep his costs down. Quote, he employed only 14 to 16-year-old youths in his factory to dodge adult award wage rates. Read that again. 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds, in a foundry, casting brass. The Beverley site earned its nickname in the western suburbs. They called it, quote, the Boy Farm. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records the consequence in one careful sentence. Quote, accidents were not uncommon. Read that again. Accidents were not uncommon in a foundry with teenagers. And Barton Pope did not stop there. Through his career, he opposed including women in the basic wage. He opposed reducing the working week from 48 hours to 44. He opposed reducing it again from 44 hours to 40. The Pope brand the country would come to love was built, in its first decade, on the backs of teenage boys paid under award rates in unsafe conditions. Here's the kicker. By 1953, 25 years after registering Pope Sprinklers Limited, Barton Pope had figured out something he had not understood in his 30s. That year, the company paid bonuses to workers that exceeded dividends to shareholders. He built a recreation hall at Beverley. He sponsored worker sports clubs. The man who had run the Boy Farm in 1929 had become by 1953 what the trade press called a model employer. The transformation was not absolution. The Boy Farm had happened. The accidents had happened. The 14-year-olds were now in their 40s, with the foundry fumes still in their lungs and the names of the boys who had been hurt still in nobody's archive. But the company that emerged from the Boy Farm, the company that built 3,000 jobs by 1957, was by then an Australian institution. And on the 3rd of September 1939, an Australian institution was about to be conscripted. By September 1939, the Boy Farm was about to be conscripted. Brass shell parts, anti-tank gun components, stamped fittings for the Commonwealth Munitions Factory at Maribyrnong. A war was coming, and the Pope factory at Beverley was about to become part of the Australian Army's spare parts catalogue. Chapter 4. Stamped Parts for Maribyrnong. September 1939. Britain declares war on Germany. Australia follows within hours. And in the Adelaide industrial belt, the western suburbs that Sir Thomas Playford had spent 6 years building, the brass moulds, the stamping presses, the sheet metal lines that had been pouring out washing machines and sprinklers were about to be conscripted. The Department of Munitions was established by the Commonwealth Government on the 11th of June, 1940, exactly 1 week after the evacuation of Dunkirk. Playford, who would serve as South Australian Premier from 1938 to 1965, the longest tenure in Australian political history, lobbied harder than any state leader for South Australia's share of dispersed armaments production. The strategic argument was simple. Sydney and Melbourne were vulnerable to attack. Adelaide, far from the eastern seaboard, was safer. By November 1940, the Salisbury Explosives Factory, Australia's largest, was under construction on the northern outskirts of Adelaide. By February 1941, the Finsbury Munitions Factory, 5 kilometres from Beverley, was producing shell casings, cartridges and fuses. The completed shells were railed north to Salisbury for filling with explosive, and in September 1939, the Commonwealth Government had purchased the General Motors Holden's plant at Birkenhead to build the carriages for 2-pounder and 6-pounder anti-tank guns and the mountings for Polston 20mm anti-aircraft cannons. The first 2-pounder prototype arrived at Birkenhead from Melbourne by rail, 3 weeks after Dunkirk. And in the middle of that wartime industrial map, Salisbury North, Finsbury East, Birkenhead South, sat Pope Products, Charles Road, Beverley. The Pope Products Limited, Silver Anniversary, 1925 to 1950. Commemorative volume, printed by the Advertiser Printing Office in 1950, held today in the State Library of South Australia, records what the Pope factory made for the war. Chiefly stamped and cast parts for munitions destined for the Commonwealth Munitions Factory at Maribyrnong, Victoria, and for aircraft production at the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation at Fisherman's Bend. Read that again. Stamped brass shell parts, cast fittings, sheet metal pressings, shipped east by rail from Beverley to Melbourne, assembled at Maribyrnong into the rifles and the shell casings that fought the Pacific War. Assembled at Fisherman's Bend into the aircraft components that flew over Darwin and Rabaul and Boonah. The workforce multiplied. The 14 to 16-year-olds of the Boy Farm, now in their 20s, were joined by women, by older men, by the first wave of European migrants who had begun arriving in Adelaide in the 1930s. The patriotic debt was real. The Pope factory ran day and night for 6 years, supplying the army that defended Australia. The Pope rotary sprinkler did not stop being made, but for half a decade, brass that should have been gardens was brass that was guns. And when the war ended in 1945, the Pope factory at Beverley did not return to peacetime production. It expanded. 6 years of munitions had built the largest single industrial workforce in the Adelaide suburbs, and the man who had been knighted for it was about to build the empire of the post-war suburb. Chapter 5, 3000, 1945. The war ends. The Pope factory at Beverley floats a holding company, Pope Industries Limited, Sir Sidney Barton. Pope, though not yet knighted, is chairman and managing director. In 1959, the knighthood comes. The citation reads, "For services to commerce and industry." Sir Sidney Barton Pope. And the post-war catalogue is something to behold. Petrol-powered rotary lawnmowers, hi-fi stereo systems, television sets, manufactured at Beverley under licence from Motorola of the United States from 1957 onwards. Agricultural sprinklers under the brand names Typhoon, Monsoon, Premier, Butterfly, the Ned Kelly repeating cap gun, the Aussie single-shot cap gun, washing machines, refrigerators, the Pope Tucker Box freezer, winner of a National Design Award in the 1960s, hedge trimmers, push mowers, ride-on mowers, garden hoses, tap timers. The expansion went beyond Adelaide. Pope Engineering Western Australia Proprietary Limited opened in Perth. Electric motors shipped to Beverley for the white goods line. The Finsbury factory, the same Finsbury that had stamped shell casings during the war, was converted to peacetime production. Sheet metal, electroplating, stove enamelling, 500 horsepower industrial electric motors. By 1957, Pope had offices and warehouses in every Australian state. And the workforce reached 3,000 people in a single Adelaide suburb, making sprinklers, washing machines, television sets, hi-fis, refrigerators, hedge trimmers and freezers. Let that number sit for a moment. Harley Pope, Barton's nephew, a senior executive, told the trade press in the late 1950s that South Australia had the highest washing machine ownership rate of any state, and Pope, at Beverley, made most of them. The cultural penetration was total. The Pope Show, compared first by Jack Davey on radio in the early 1950s, then by Terry Deer on television in the late 1950s, gave Pope appliances away as prizes every week to Australian families. The pun is the Pope a washing machine entered Australian English. And in 1953, 25 years after he had registered the boy farm at Robert Street, Croydon, Barton Pope did something extraordinary. The bonuses paid to Pope workers in that year exceeded the dividends paid to Pope shareholders. A recreation hall was built at Beverley. Worker sports clubs were sponsored. The man who, in 1929, had run the foundry on under-award teenage wages had become, by 1953, the model employer in his own town. And on the factory floor at Beverley, by the late 1950s, the workforce was no longer the Anglo-Saxon Adelaide of Barton Pope's youth. The Italian families of Lockleys and Royal Park, the Greek families of West Hindmarsh, the Yugoslav and Lebanese families who arrived in the 1960s. They packed the dispatch bay, they ran the moulding lines, they drove the forklifts. Their names are not in any public archive. The State Library of South Australia holds the Pope Industries worker rolls under reference BIG 323. They are not online. The men and women who built Pope's Peak are, like the factory itself, undocumented. But in 1963, Sir Barton Pope, 62 years old, knighted, the founder of South Australia's largest single industrial workforce, agreed to merge his company with another Adelaide manufacturer, and the founding family, slowly, began to step away. Chapter 6. The Cost of the Empire. Here's the thing about industrial empires built behind protectionist tariff walls. They cannot be defended forever. And the men who built them, like Sir Charles McGrath at Repco, like Jeff Russell before him, almost never see the wall come down in their own lifetimes. In 1963, Suburb Pope amalgamated Pope products with A. Simpson and Son, the Adelaide-based washing machine manufacturer founded by Alfred Simpson in 1853. The new entity was Simpson Pope Holdings Limited. Alfred Simpson had built his original tinsmithing business on Gawler Place in the centre of Adelaide, more than a century before Barton Pope was born. By 1963, the Simpson empire was in the hands of Alfred's great-grandson, 5 generations, one Adelaide family. The strategic logic of the merger was defensive. The two Adelaide industrial dynasties, Pope and Simpson, had spent 30 years competing in the same suburb for the same domestic market. Both saw the coming wave of imports. Both saw the writing on the wall. The deal was negotiated through 1962 and announced in early 1963. Suburb Pope was 62. The 5th generation Simpson, Anthony Simpson, was younger by 20 years. But the merger came with a cost. The product range ballooned. White goods, Simpson's expertise, sprinklers, Popes, hi-fi, television, hedge trimmers, mowers, refrigerators, cap guns, drip irrigation, tap timers. By 1970, Simpson Pope was a conglomerate with no internal industrial logic, a holding company assembled to defend market share, not to manufacture anything in particular. In 1979, the corporate name changed again. The Pope disappeared. The new entity was Simpson Holdings Limited. The Pope brand survived only as a product line within Simpson's catalogue. And on the floor at Beverley, through the 1960s and 70s, the migrant workforce kept running the lines. The conditions were what 1960s and 1970s Australian heavy east industry conditions were. Foundry fumes, stamping presses. The metal dust nobody measured. The early retirements nobody documented. The cardiac arrests in the 60s that the coroner recorded as cardiac arrests, but that the families knew were 40 years of solvent and brass dust and stove enamel. Suburb Pope spent his last decade as a non-executive director, watching the company he had built drift away from the family that built it. He travelled, he gardened, he attended North Adelaide Baptist Church. On the 2nd of September 1983, at Tullamarine Airport in Melbourne, between flights in the departure lounge, Sir Sidney Barton Pope died. Myocardial infarction. He was 78 years old. He had outlived his first wife, Lily Maria Howard, whom he had divorced in 1942 after 15 years of marriage. He had outlived almost none of his original boy farm workers, whose lifespans had been shorter than his by 20 years on average. He left a second wife, Ada Lillian McCarthy, formerly the nurse at the Beverley factory, and 2 sons and an adopted daughter who were not industrial managers. The funeral notice ran in the Adelaide Advertiser. The flag at the Beverley factory was lowered to half-mast. The founder was gone. The empire was bigger than the family that had built it, and from 1985 onwards, the family that had built the empire was no longer running it. And in 1986, 3 years after the founder's death, the family that had built the empire walked away. The buyer was a Sydney-based industrial conglomerate called Email Limited. The era of Australian family ownership was over. Chapter 7. The First Sale, 1986. Email Limited of Sydney acquires Simpson Holdings of Adelaide. The name Email stood for Electrical Equipment Manufacturing Industries Australia Limited, a Sydney-based industrial conglomerate that had spent the 1980s on an acquisition tear. Email already owned Westinghouse refrigerators, Kelvinator, chef stoves and Dishlex dishwashers. With Simpson Pope, Email controlled most of the Australian white goods manufacturing industry. Read that again. Westinghouse, Kelvinator, Chef, Dishlex, Simpson, Pope. 6 of the 7 biggest names in Australian white goods, all sitting inside one Sydney holding company by 1986. The sale was overseen on the Simpson side by Anthony Simpson, the 5th generation Simpson managing director. The last family principal of the dynasty, Alfred Simpson, had founded in 1853. The Pope side of the transaction was overseen by Simpson's board. By then, no member of the Pope family was in executive control. And here's the thing about that sale. The honest framing, the one the trade press of the time did not always reach, is that it was rational generational exit, not betrayal. Barton Pope's two sons and adopted daughter were not industrial managers. Anthony Simpson's heirs were not industrial managers. The Australian family-owned manufacturing model, the model that had produced Pope, Simpson, Sidtrome, Sellies, Holden and Repco, was reaching the end of its natural life cycle. The founders were dying. The next generation had gone to law, to medicine, to merchant banking. The third generation was at university. The Simpsons sold because family succession had failed. The Popes had stepped away already. The same story played out across 100 Australian manufacturers in the 1980s. But the consequences were industrial. Email strategy was conglomerate consolidation, buying Australian manufacturers, stripping costs, harvesting brands. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, email squeezed margins, closed redundant production lines and slowly rationalised the Beverley factory. The Beverley workforce, 3,000 strong in 1957, was by the mid-1990s less than half that number. The mowers had gone, the cap guns had gone, the television sets had gone. What remained at Beverley was white goods assembly and the Pope Garden range. The backdrop was the slow death of Australian tariff protection. The Whitlam tariff cut of the 18th of July, 1973, 25% across the board, effective midnight, announced at 7 o'clock in the evening on national television. The hawk carding dollar float of December 1983. The button car plan of 1984 and 1985. And then, in the 2000S and 2010S, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and the China Free Trade Agreement, eliminating the last residual tariff protection on garden goods and white goods. Every layer of protection that had built the Pope empire was stripped year by year. The Hawke and Keating governments had decided deliberately that Australian manufacturing would not be defended anymore. In 1999, email itself was broken up, the conglomerate roll-up reversed. The Sydney Holding Company, that had spent the 1980s buying Australian manufacturers, spent the late 1990s selling them off in pieces. The white goods division was put on the market, and in 2000, the Swedish multinational Electrolux, the largest appliance manufacturer in Europe, headquartered in Stockholm, listed on the Nasdaq Stockholm Exchange, acquired the appliance arm of email for an undisclosed sum, reported in the AFR at over 400 million Australian dollars. The deal included the Westinghouse brand, the Kelvinator brand, the Chef brand, the Dishlex brand, the Simpson brand, and the Pope white goods brand. The brand that had been Australian family owned from 1924 to 1986, then Australian conglomerate owned from 1986 to 2000, was now Swedish. And on a single morning in early 2008, a Swedish corporation in Stockholm decided that manufacturing in Adelaide was no longer profitable. The Beverley factory, the Boy Farm, the wartime munitions plant, the peak of 3,000 jobs, went silent. Chapter 8. The Silent Factory. Early 2008, the South Australian Environment Protection Authority, in its formal 2016 assessment of the Beverley industrial site, records the moment in one sentence. Quote, Pope, as Electrolux operated at Beverley up to the early 2008 when manufacturing operations were ceased and the land was sold. Read that again. Manufacturing operations were ceased. The land was sold. The end was not a single shift bell. There was no dramatic last day photograph in the Adelaide Advertiser. There was no AMWU rally outside the gates. It was a slow severance over months. a Swedish corporate decision made in Stockholm, executed in stages across the first half of 2008. The migrant workforce who had run the lines for 3 decades, the Italian fathers, the Greek mothers, the Yugoslav fitters, the Lebanese forklift drivers, packed up their lockers and went home for the last time. Their names are not in the public record. Their oral histories are not online. And here's what made it worse. 2008 was the same year that Mitsubishi closed its Lonsdale plant at Tonsley Park, ending Mitsubishi car manufacturing in Australia. The collapse of South Australian industry was simultaneous. The Adelaide manufacturing economy that Sir Thomas Playford had spent 30 years building was unwinding in a single calendar year. A portion of the former Pope land at Beverley was sold to a small Australian irrigation company. According to the SA EPA's 2016 assessment, the buyer was Arias Irrigation Systems Proprietary Limited, now trading as Toro Australia. Toro Australia, a subsidiary of the Toro Company of Bloomington, Minnesota, a US-listed corporation that had been distributing the Pope Garden brand since approximately 2003, when it absorbed the Australian arm of James Hardie Irrigation. Read that again. The Pope land at Beverley was sold to an American company. The Pope rotary sprinkler, the brass 3-arm sprinkler that had ticked over 1 million buffalo grass lawns from the 1930s to the 2000s, kept being made. Partly at Howards Road, Beverley, partly overseas. But the empire was over. The brand survived. The factory did not. The 3,000 jobs did not. And the wider Adelaide collapse continued. On the 20th of October 2017, the last GM Holden Commodore rolled off the Elizabeth production line, ending 70 years of South Australian car making. Mitsubishi gone, Holden gone, Bridgestone gone, Penrice Soda gone, Westinghouse gone, Pope Manufacturing gone. The Playford industrial state was by 2017 no longer industrial. And on the 1st of July 2024, a press release was issued from Long Island, New York. A holding company called Griffon Corporation announced that its subsidiary, AMES Australasia, had completed the acquisition of Pope Products. The price was 21.8 million Australian dollars. Chapter 9. $20.8 million. The 1st of July 2024. A press release from Griffon Corporation, New York Stock Exchange ticker symbol GFF, announces that its Australian subsidiary, AMAS Australasia, has completed the acquisition of the Pope Products business from the Toro Company of Bloomington, Minnesota. The purchase price, 20.8 million Australian dollars, approximately 14.5 million US dollars. Read that again. $20.8 million for a 99-year-old Australian brand that, at its peak in 1957, employed 3,000 people in a single Adelaide suburb. Per Griffon's SEC 10K filing of the 13th of November 2024, the Pope acquisition added the brand to the AMES Australasia portfolio, alongside Cyclone, Nilex Hills, Northcote Pottery, Quattro Design and Apta. Read that one again. Cyclone, Nilex, Hills, Northcote Pottery, 6 Australian household brands, every one of them familiar to anyone who has ever walked through an Australian hardware store. Cyclone, the fencing and wire brand since 1923. Nilex, the hose and irrigation brand since 1925. Hills, the Hills Hoist clothesline brand since 1945. Northcote Pottery, Melbourne Ceramics since 1897, all sitting inside the same New York holding company. And the Griffon Corporation 10K filing uses a phrase that should make every Australian reader stop reading. Quote, asset-light global sourcing strategy. Read that again. Asset-light global sourcing strategy. That is the corporate euphemism. It means own the brand, offshore the manufacturing, distribute through retail. Keep the trademark, lose the factory. On the 30th of September 2024, 3 months after the Pope acquisition, Griffon completed the next stage of the strategy globally. 4 manufacturing sites closed, 4 wood mills closed, approximately 600 jobs cut, 1.2 million square feet of manufacturing footprint eliminated. The model is on the public record. The Adelaide redundancy has not yet been announced, but the model is clear. Pope's Australian manufacturing footprint after the 1st of July 2024 is a small operation at 53 Howards Road, Beverley, moulding the Waterbird sprinkler range, extruding the DripMax drip tube, and packaging the Aquatrax irrigation tape. The original main Pope plant between Pope Street and Charles Street, Beverley, has been demolished and replaced by an industrial subdivision. The streets named after the company outlived the company. And on the Bunnings clamshell at any garden centre in Australia in 2026, the sticker reads, quote, "Born in a shed in Adelaide in 1925. True. And owned in New York in 2024. And in New York, the man who signed the Pope acquisition, the man who paid $20.8 million Australian dollars for the 99-year-old brand, earned more in 12 months than the entire company sold for." Chapter 10. $16.5 million. Ronald J. Kramer, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Griffon Corporation. Based in New York, New York. Office at 712 Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, 18 blocks south of Central Park. His total compensation for fiscal year 2024 disclosed in Griffon's SEC Def 14. A proxy filing and index by the AFL-CIO Paywatch database was $16,550,460 US. His pay ratio, also per the AFL-CIO Paywatch database, was 304 times the compensation of Griffon's median employee. Let that number sit for a moment. 304 to 1. Now here is the kicker. The Pope brand was sold to Griffon in 2024 for $21.8 million Australian dollars, approximately $14.5 million US. Ronald Kramer's total compensation for that same year, $16.5 million US, exceeded the entire purchase price of the company his firm bought. In Australian dollars at prevailing exchange rates, Kramer earned approximately $25 million Australian dollars in 2024. The 1928 founding capital of Pope Sprinklers Limited was £15,000, roughly 1.3 million Australian dollars in today's money. Read that one again. The annual pay of a single New York chief executive in 2024 exceeded the founding capital of the entire Pope empire by a factor of 19, and exceeded the 2024 purchase price by approximately 3 million Australian dollars. Griffon Corporation is listed on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker GFF. It operates through 2 segments, home and building products, which owns the Cornell Cookson and Clopay garage door businesses, and consumer and professional products, the AMA's portfolio, where Pope sits. The consumer and professional products segment generated approximately $1 billion US in fiscal year 2024 revenue. The Pope brand, according to Griffon's fiscal year 2025 disclosure, contributed approximately $25 million US in first full-year revenue to the parent company. Read that again. A 99-year-old Australian brand. $25 million US to the New York Stock Exchange. In 2026, Pope rotary sprinklers, garden hoses, tap timers and drip irrigation systems are still sold in Bunnings, Mitre 10, and the surviving fragments of Australia's hardware retail network. The brand is everywhere, but the Australian manufacturing footprint is a fraction of what existed in 2007. Moulding at Beverley. Distribution from Sydney. Design partly in Adelaide. Sourcing partly overseas. The asset-light global sourcing strategy in operation. Walk down Robert Street, West Croydon today and you will find the original 1925 site. The backyard foundry is gone. The house is gone. The fittings that Henry Pope cast for his son's first sprinkler are gone. But the brand still exists, and the country that built it does not own it. Chapter 11. What 3,000 Jobs Built. Stand on Robert Street, West Croydon today. The houses are weatherboard and brick, painted in the colours of the 1950s. The Pope foundry is gone. The original 1925 shed is gone. Number 56 is now a private home. The residents have no idea. The postman has no idea. The children playing on the front lawn have no idea that this is where the rotary sprinkler was born. Drive 5 kilometres west to Beverley. The streets named after the company, Pope Street, Charles Street, Howards Road, are still there. The main factory between Pope Street and Charles Street is gone, replaced by an industrial subdivision of small light engineering shops and an Electrolux distribution warehouse. Drive to 53 Howards Road. A modest building. Moulding machines inside. The Pope brand is still being made, owned by AMA's Australasia, owned by Griffon Corporation, owned in New York. The Bunnings, 2 suburbs away, sells a plastic and brass Pope rotary sprinkler for $14.98. The sticker on the box says born in a shed in Adelaide in 1925. True. And owned in New York in 2024. Lesson 1. What war proved, peace dismantled. In 1940, the Pope factory at Beverley could be converted in 18 months from making sprinklers to stamping brass parts for anti-tank gun shells. By 2008, the same factory could not compete with Chinese hose connectors. The country that mobilised industrial capability in 18 months in 1940 dismantled it in 25 years from 1973. The capability is gone. The brand survives. The buildings do not. And the country that, in 1942, could ship stamped brass shell parts by rail from Beverley to Maribyrnong day and night for 6 years, today cannot make a hose fitting that competes on price with one from Guangzhou. Lesson 2. The brand outlives the country that built it. Pope today exists. Pope manufacturing barely does. Sir Sidney Barton. Pope died in 1983 believing, like Sir Charles McGrath at Repco, like every Australian industrialist of his generation, that protection would last forever and the brand would always belong to the family. The protection ended. The family stepped away in 1986. The brand was sold 4 times in 38 years. To Email Limited in 1986, to Electrolux in 2000, to the Toro Company in approximately 2003, to Griffon Corporation in 2024. Each owner harvested margin. Each owner cut manufacturing. The brand kept walking. The country that built it did not. Lesson 3. The Boy Farm ends in New York. A company that, in 1928, employed 14 to 16-year-old youths at under-award wages in a foundry where accidents were not uncommon, is owned, in 2024, by a New York chief executive whose annual compensation is 304 times the pay of his median worker. The exploitation did not end. It moved offshore and it moved onshore in the boardroom. The labour arbitrage that built the Pope foundry in the 1930s is the same labour arbitrage that closed the Beverley factory in 2008, and the same labour arbitrage that pays Ronald Kramer $16.5 million in 2024. The Boy Farm did not end. It just relocated. The brass 3-arm Pope rotary sprinkler is still in the Bunnings clamshell. The price is $14.98. The sticker says born in a shed in Adelaide in 1925. The shed is gone. The factory is gone. The 3,000 jobs are gone. The founder is dead. The country still owns the streets named after the company, and nothing else. Made strong. Made to last. The sprinkler survives. The country that built it is somewhere else.